I believed love was a train, steady, scheduled, faithful. Then one ordinary night, a screen lit up, and the rhythm I trusted cracked. I didn't rage. I listened. To the silence, to the coins in my pocket, to the clock that stopped on our wedding day. What came next wasn't revenge. It was a new story, one I'd build with my own hands, one track at a time. I believed in simple love that moved like a train that kept the same schedule every day and only whistled when it needed to, and I believed in the way she kissed my cheek before work and asked about my day after and let her hand find mine as we fell asleep, and for years that rhythm ran like a clean engine, and I built my plans on the sound of it, and I kept my shoes by the door and my coffee mug on the second shelf, and the dog learned when to expect the treat, because love to me meant routine, and to me routine meant faith, and I did not think faith could rust from the inside without a sound, and yet that is exactly what happened. The night it cracked had no lightning and no dramatic soundtrack, and the oven clock blinked the right time, and the street outside felt like any street in our town, and she said she needed a shower, and I rinsed my plate, and the house settled in that patient way old houses practice, and then the screen on her phone woke and spilled cold light across the counter, and I did not mean to look, and I had never been a snooper, and I always thought snooping was like stealing answers on a test that no one graded anyway, and still my eyes took in the words, and my chest went hollow and small, and I felt like the floor had stepped away from me the way a wave slides back and leaves your feet in air. The message wore a red heart like a little badge, and I watched that wordless emblem burn through years of breakfast and yard work and birthdays and movie nights and all the quiet Tuesdays, and my head put up defenses that failed in order, and I told myself it might be a joke, and I told myself it might be a wrong number, and I told myself people use hearts for everything these days, and a voice I had trained to ignore answered with a flat no, and that voice belonged to the man I pretend I am not, and he said, "You already know." Her lock screen never asked me for permission because she had never expected I would need it, and my thumb did nothing, and the glass slid open like a door that knew the hinges by heart, and the archive unrolled like a spilled tape, and there were late words and early words and photos with cheerful light that had never touched our porch, and there were plans set for hours when I thought she was chasing deadlines, and the words she never used on me anymore hung there, like shirts drying on a stranger line, and I felt foolish, and I felt old, and I felt too calm for a man whose life had just been redrafted by someone else. The water in the bathroom ran like a steady river, and I thought about how many times I had heard that same ordinary river and said to myself, look at that, we made it another day, and the sound turned strange in my ears like a language I knew as a child and forgot at 19, and I stared at the tiles and at the knife block and at the pot with the wooden spoon still inside, and every object looked as if it had been used in a play where I had been the extra who smiled at the right time and never got a line. There is a small clock above our sink that came from a yard sale, and on the face a faded rooster announces a sunrise that never changes, and that clock stopped once on our wedding morning, and the old woman who sold it told us it does that when it wants attention, and for years I have laughed at that little superstition because I am a practical man who can fix a leaky trap with tape and patience, and who can coax a rattling vent back into sense, and yet when I looked up that night the rooster pointed at the exact minute our vows had begun, and the second hand stuck in place as if it was tired, and I do not pretend I am a prophet, but I notice patterns, and that one spoke in a language older than both of us. She came out with a towel on her head and her skin warm from steam and the smile that could have sold me a second life, and her eyes followed the straight line from my face to the phone and then back, and the smile thinned and folded and vanished, and the water still sounded behind her because she never turns the tap tight on the first try, and I considered the many thousands of words a man could use in a moment like that, and the many gestures, and I found none I wanted, and so I stood and she stood. And the house held its breath the way a hunter holds his, and we said nothing. Silence is an honest worker, and it told me more in that kitchen than any confession would have, and I could feel it lay a tape down the middle of the room like a chalk line on a street, and on one side stood the man who believed in trains, and on the other side stood the man who listens when the rooster stops, and I did not cry, and I did not rage, and I did not walk her through the evidence because the evidence had already walked me through, and when I finally set the phone down I felt the smallest shiver of something I do not advertise, and I call it the thin place where the world we measure and the world that measures us rub together like two coins in a pocket, and you hear the metal sing. I slept beside her that night as my body has done for years, and a new country stretched between us though the mattress never changed, and I watched a square of streetlights slide across the ceiling in a slow march, and I let my mind hold two truths at once, the one where I had a wife who kissed my cheek, and the one where I shared a roof with someone who lived two lives, and the air tasted like a copper penny between your teeth, and when my eyes finally closed I saw a river that accepted rings from both hands and carried them without splash, and I woke with the shape of that current still in my palms, and a simple thought that had no decoration. I was not married to a woman then, I was married to a story, and the story had decided to survive without me, and I would need another story, and I would need it fast, and I would need it to be true even when it bent the light. And to build that kind of story, a man must first stop pretending that routine is the same as love, and that safety is the same as faith, and that a rooster only stops for batteries and not for omens. And the old woman at the yard sale would have laughed and said finally, and I would have asked her what comes next, and she would have said, you step into the thin place and you walk until your feet find ground that answers back. So I lay there and listened to my house breathe, and to my wife dream, and to the new silence build its scaffolding, and I rested my hand over my heart like a man who keeps an oath, and I thought about the train I had believed in and the whistle I had never heard, and I made a plain decision that did not need a lawyer yet, and did not need a priest, and did not need a headline, and it went like this: tomorrow I start listening to the coins. Morning arrived like a technician who does not knock, and I got up ahead of the alarm and let the house speak, and I heard the vents draw a steady breath, and I heard the fridge hum like it had been told a secret, and I listened for the coins because I had told myself I would, and I found 2 quarters in the dish by the door, and a silver dollar my father had pressed into my palm on the day we signed the mortgage, and I slid them into my pocket, and I felt foolish for a heartbeat, and then I felt the small living thrum that happens when a man finally pays attention to what he already knew, and the coins lay there like 3 little instruments that just needed a hand to wake them. She moved through the kitchen with a smile that practiced balance, and she reached for the mug with the chipped handle, and she asked about my sleep, and every word sat fine on the plate until she said she would be late at the office, and the coins knocked lightly against each other with no help from my legs, and I looked at her mouth and saw a tiny tremor that I had missed for a year, and maybe longer, and I answered with a sentence that sounded like any other day, and I watched the rooster clock above the sink, and the second hand which had been stuck crept forward 1 notch like an old dog trying to stand, and then stopped again, and I felt the thin place lift its corner like a rug that hides a trapdoor, and I knew I would spend the day mapping its edges. I told my own office that I had a throat thing, and I took a drive without a destination because directions are for men with maps, and I had come to think my marriage had been a map that left out the ravine, and I headed to the old neighborhood where we had bought the rooster clock because omens get lonely and like company, and the yard sale house stood quiet with a blue curtain in the window, and I knocked because I am persistent, and a woman in a robe shaped like a quilt told me her mother had moved to a place with nurses and puzzles, and she asked if I wanted to come in, and I said no because I was following a line I could not explain without sounding like a man who collects bottle caps, and she nodded as if she understood that exact kind of line, and she said the clock you took likes the smell of rain more than the smell of soup, which was a sentence that should not make sense and did. I walked to the corner store where men argue about football in all seasons and bought a cheap notebook and a pen that promised no smears, and I sat on a bench that had memorial words for a man I never met, and I started making a ledger because I trust ledgers and because you cannot rebuild a life with fog, and I wrote down the first time I felt her go quiet after a kiss, and the first party where she slipped outside to take a call that lasted the length of an old song, and the first time she came home with a scent that did not live in our house, and I wrote the name I had seen repeated in the messages, and I wrote the cross streets of the little coffee shop I thought I recognized in a photo, and I drew a box around the hours that did not add up, and the numbers looked like a payroll for a ghost crew that installed new walls while I slept. I took the coins out and laid them on the page like witnesses, and I made a rule that they get to weigh in, and I went to the coffee shop because that is what a reasonable man does when he has unreasonable evidence, and the bell on the door made a weak sound, and the chalkboard menu bragged about beans from a farm that probably hates bragging, and I sat where I could see the room, and I put the coins in a neat stack, and I waited, and 3 songs later she walked in with sunglasses, though the sky had given up on glare, and a man came in from the other door, and they stood too straight the way people do when they care too much and want to pretend otherwise, and the coins in my pocket made a soft clicking that no one else heard, and the rooster's second hand in my mind took another step, and I felt something between relief and a toothache because the truth is pain with manners. I did not storm, and I did not introduce myself, and I did not ask anyone for explanations because explanations are like napkins and only useful when you have already spilled, and I watched the way his hand hovered near her elbow without touching, and the way she tilted her head and exposed a line of throat that used to be my favorite view in the world, and I kept my face still, and I ran a private inventory of the things I had done right and the things I had done wrong, and I found both categories well stocked, which is a good sign that you are not lying to yourself. She left first, and the man stayed to talk to a barista about a fundraiser, and I could see his teeth were too even and his shoes were new in a way that told a story about a man who likes boxes more than he likes roads, and I decided I did not hate him because hate has a way of canceling useful thoughts, and I stood and I walked out, and I felt the coins go cold, which I understood as an instruction to stay patient, and so I did. I drove to the river that curls around the edge of town because water is the oldest witness, and because I needed to talk to something that cannot betray anyone, and I stood on a footbridge with a plank missing, and I opened my hand and let the silver dollar rest on my palm, and I asked for a sign without using words because I have learned that the world hears quiet better than it hears speeches, and a breeze moved through the trees like someone running a thumb across a comb, and the water below me caught a strip of light and shaped it into a path that pointed toward the west where the old rail yard rusts, and in that fading yard sits a decommissioned switch house with a roof of patched tin, and I used to cut through there as a boy, and I remember how the air in that building felt heavy like an attic full of winter, and I do not claim magic but I claim memory, and sometimes the two hold hands. I went there in late afternoon and found the place unchanged except for ivy that had won the argument and a new lock that had not cost much, and I stood in the doorway and listened, and the coins rattled like they were laughing, and I realized they were not laughing at me but at the joke the world had made, which was to hide the answer in the first place I ever learned to read signs, and I looked down and saw fresh tire tracks pale in the dust and a shoe print with a sole pattern I had seen on the man in the coffee shop, and I knew this was their place, which meant it was also mine in exactly the way a crime scene belongs to the victim as much as it does to the thief. I did not cross the threshold because I believe in lines and also in patience, and because I felt the thin place press against my chest like a door whose other side is crowded, and I backed away, and I sat on a broken pallet, and I made a plan with the kind of calm that usually only shows up when you think you are fixing a sink, and I decided to let the truth walk the last mile on its own instead of dragging it, because dragged truth plays dead and walking truth will stand up and speak, and I took the coins out and set them in the sun, and they warmed fast, and I took that as a yes. I went home before she did, and I cooked a simple dinner, and I set the table the way we always have, and I told the rooster clock to wake up and work for me, and when she came in with her bag and that light soap smell that has become a stranger, I watched her face when she saw the plates, because guilt hates symmetry, and she kept her smile steady, and we ate, and we talked about the neighbor dog who escapes every week and finds his way back, and about the crack in the driveway, and about the show she thinks we should watch, and the coins lay against my thigh without a whisper, because for that hour she did not lie, and there was a comfort in that, like feeling sun on your back in winter. After dishes I told her I would take a walk, and I did not wait for permission, and I went to the garage and opened the old toolbox where I keep a past life in the form of a flashlight and a roll of tape and a Polaroid from a job site where I still had more hair, and I took the flashlight and the tape and I left the photo because nostalgia makes a poor ally, and I walked back to the switch house under streetlights that know me, and I opened the lock with patience and a piece of bent metal, and the door sighed like someone who had tried to keep a secret and failed, and I stepped into the thin place with a calm I did not have yesterday, and I told the room my name, and I told it I was not a thief, and I told it I only wanted the truth to put its shoes on and come home with me, and in the dusty light the coins in my pocket began to sing. The switch house had a smell like wet pennies and old rain and something baked by summers that came and left without asking, and the tin roof ticked with a slow expansion that felt like a breath, and my light moved across the walls and found the kind of graffiti that men leave when they need a mark that says I was here, and the dust on the floor writhed in the beam like minnows, and there were two chairs pulled to face each other and a blanket folded in that rough way that looks tidy until a careful eye notices the careless edge, and a thermos dented where a hand grips without thinking, and a paper cup with a lipstick ghost that did not belong to any memory I had a right to, and there was a hair tie on the windowsill that looked like a snake ring to sleep, and my stomach turned with the same motion as a wheel when it leaves the rail for a heartbeat and finds it again. I stood inside and told myself I would not steal from this place because theft steals from the thief in ways that cost extra, and yet I collected details the way a fisherman collects the shimmer of scales in the dark, and I saw a chalk circle on the floor with 4 hash marks like a game that never finished, and I saw an old railroad calendar with pages torn back to May, though the current month spoke plainly outside, and on the trapped air a smell of cinnamon told me someone had tried to be cozy in a building that had not been made for softness, and my dry humor did the only thing it could and said, well, at least they have taste, and my own voice answered that taste does not buy absolution, and I kept walking. The coins in my pocket made a low tone as if a thumb had stroked a string, and I put the light on the far corner where an old switch lever rose from the floor like the hilt of a sword buried to the guard, and I touched the iron, and it was warm though it had no right to be, and in that touch I felt the thin place close like a hand over mine, and the lever wanted me to move it, and I knew better than to perform for the unseen, but I also knew that sometimes you have to touch the thing that hurts in order to find where the infection ends and the skin begins, and so I leaned my weight, and the lever slid with a sound the room enjoyed, and somewhere outside in a field long bare a forgotten track chose a different path, and I heard a train that did not exist lay down a horn note that threaded itself into my bones. I went to work then not as an avenger and not as a detective and not as a jealous husband, because those uniforms are heavy with theater, and I wanted to be a carpenter building a frame that could carry truth, and I took the tape from my pocket and I strung a line across the inside of the door at the height of a wrist, and I did it in a way that would break not loudly but certainly, and I drew a small dot on the tape with the pen I had bought, and I placed the dot where it would rub off on skin if Someone brushed past and I pressed my light into the corners and found a gray mound of plaster dust near the blanket, and I dipped my fingers and spread a thin film across the bare floor near the chairs, so that any foot would sign its name in the language of prints, and I set the hair tie exactly 2 inches from the sill edge because I wanted to see if a hand that was used to this room would absent-mindedly put it back where muscle memory believes it belongs. On the wall there were old timetables and cracked frames, and I read the names of towns where I had never stopped, and one of those names sat in my mouth with the shape of a word from the messages I had seen, and I knew with that boring certainty that I both respect and despise that the man liked to play at destiny with small props, and one of those props was going to be this abandoned room and a rhythm you could hear if you held still, and to that rhythm I added another instrument because I took the silver dollar from my pocket and I stood with it in my palm, and I sent a small apology to my father who had loved simple tools, and I wedged that coin under the foot of one chair so that the tiniest weight would produce a tilt, and the tilt would produce a ring, and the ring would tell me or the walls or the room who sat where and how hard and for how long, and I did not know if the thin place cares about metallurgy, but I know the built world loves feedback. And a coin is a bell if you ask it kindly. I backed out and left the door almost shut, and I laid a sliver of tape across the outer latch in a way that no one sees unless they are the type who check latches for sport, and I walked to the street that has no streetlights, and I stood in a shadow with a notebook pressed against my thigh, and I felt that old temptation to hurl myself into a scene and force every mouth to tell every truth, and I let it pass the way you let a storm move off a lake, because thrashing looks like power and is not, and I am a man who has learned that stillness can make the noise confess what the noise did not mean to share. They came late and quiet and separate by 30 steps, and the man arrived first and tested the air like a deer that knows better than the hunter, and then she came, and her shoulders were tight and her mouth was a line, and she moved with precision as if the room might punish her for a wrong angle, and I stepped deeper into my shadow, and I hated that I knew her in the dark by the sound of a key on a ring, and by the way she always shakes a door once more than the door deserves, and the tape inside gave a sigh you could mistake for a mouse, and the small dot had a smear removed from its heart, and I felt no satisfaction because I am not a man who eats from that plate, and I am not a man who takes lies for breakfast. The lever I had moved earlier had decided to be theatrical, and the room hummed when the door opened, and I told myself not to read too much into a sound, but the thin place will have its way, and the coins in my pocket kept their discipline, and I placed my hand against the brick outside to feel the vibrations of two people issuing vows they will not write down, and I heard a laughter that had once fixed the worst parts of my days, and it sounded like a tune that belongs to someone else now, and I allowed that reality to stand without punching it, and then the small bell of the silver dollar announced itself from inside, and my throat tightened because I had traded a family relic to learn what my eyes already knew, and yet the ring was worth the price because it gave the room a voice, and the room said she sat in the old chair with the slanted leg, and the man leaned forward like a student, and when a chair tells you where a person sits it tells you who steers the evening, and that knowledge is not trivial when you are rebuilding a life. Their words were a murmur that the tin and the dust turned into mud, and much of it dissolved, and yet certain pieces climbed the wall and reached my ear, and I learned enough to map their time together, and I learned the days and the names and the small code that couples build when they wish to hide in plain view, and I heard my own name once, and it sounded like a town mentioned by a pilot flying somewhere else, and I felt no flames and no ice and only that quiet resolve that enters a man when a decision finds him already prepared to say yes. I could have walked in then and let the tape split on my forearm, and I could have used the light to cast their faces in a courthouse glare, and I could have delivered lines that men deliver at the end of a play that ended long before the audience realized it, and I did not because a clean ending is a lie in itself, and because I needed one more element before I could build the device that would set us all free, and that element was agreement from the other world that this was not only about betrayal but also about misalignment, and I know how that sounds if your life has never slipped into a thin place yet. The world has overlay maps we cannot see until a pressure change peels them back, and the lever under my hand earlier had given permission in a language made of iron and effort. They left with a soft click, and I waited, and then I went inside, and the air was startled and then calm, and the tape line was broken, and the dot was gone, and the dust held 2 sets of prints, and one set made a small loop as if a foot had traced a figure 8 and swooned, and in the dust loop I found a single feather dark and small, and I could have dismissed it as nothing or as a downdraft relic, and I chose to accept it as a message from the rooster clock, who likes the smell of rain and who had chosen our wedding morning to stop, and I put that feather in my notebook and drew a circle around it and wrote one sentence in a hand that looked like my father when he signed work orders, and the sentence said, "The house has a voice and it is telling you to change tracks now." I took my coin from under the chair, and it had a bright nick that made it look younger, and I pressed my thumb to the nick and felt heat, and I said a private word to my father who loved engines and steadfast things, and then I set the coin back under the chair because some offerings need time, and because I wanted the bell again later, and I gathered the hair tie and placed it in the center of the chalk circle, not to disturb but to invite, and I tied a strip of tape to the lever with a loose hitch. That would fall if a hand pulled hard, and I spoke aloud to the old iron and asked it to tell me when a choice had been made, and the roof clicked in that tick way, and I took it as an agreement. On the walk home I passed the rail yard fence, and the chain links sang in a weak breeze, and it reminded me of high school nights when the team lost and the band kept playing the same cheerful song because the sheet said to, and I laughed once without joy, and then I let my shoulders drop and I felt the coins quiet, and I understood they had finished their verse for the night, and I turned the last corner and saw our house golden at the windows, and inside the rooster clock had moved its hand forward by 5 minutes like a polite apology, and I touched the face and told it I heard the apology and would not pretend it changed the schedule. She was in bed with a book, and the lamp on my side glowed because she always leaves it for me, and I thought about the 1,000 kindnesses that populate a life and how they can turn into blindfolds if you let them, and I lay down and she asked how was the walk, and I said it was fine and that the air felt clean near the river, and she said she loved that spot, and I said I know, and the truth sat between us like a third pillow we did not admit to, and I felt neither impulse to interrogate nor urge to kiss because I was carrying a larger task than a scene, and that task had a shape like a track that bends and arrives somewhere new without anyone seeing the switch until they look back and wonder when the horizon changed color. I slept, and my dreams came uniform as a freight convoy, and they carried boxcars filled with inventory from the life I had believed in and from the life I had entered, and the cars bore chalk on their sides, and each mark said a word like stay or go or rebuild or burn, and I woke before sunrise with the simplest thought a man can have, which is do the next thing, and the next thing is set the stage for truth to walk in on its own legs and stand in our kitchen and ask for water and a chair, and I would not raise my voice, and I would not hide my face, and I would let the thin place speak through the ordinary, and I would let my coins and my clock and my lever collect their little votes, and I would listen like a man listens for a whistle he has ignored too long. Morning would come, and with it my plan, and it would begin with a note written without lies, and a meeting set without drama, and a table cleared of centerpieces that pretend seasons never end, and I would ask the world to witness, and I would trust it to send me what I needed, which might be a feather or a bell or simply the sound of her breath as she faced the line finally. And you may think this is theater, and maybe it is a kind that fixes the world a little, because we are all actors who need to stop improvising when the script we live by no longer fits, and when the rail you trusted picks a different horizon. You can either curse the engineer or you can learn to read the signals, and I have decided to do the thing my father taught me when a machine misbehaves, and he called it listening by hand, and tomorrow I will lay my hand on my life and listen until it tells me where the obstruction lies, and if the lever asks me to pull I will pull, and if the rooster asks me to wait for rain I will wait, and one way or another the train will move. Morning held its breath like a diver that wants to show off, and I sat at the table with a pen and the cheap notebook, and I wrote a note to myself that would later become a note to her, because I have learned that a man should rehearse mercy, and I drafted lines that promise plain talk and no theatrics, and a drive at dusk, and a request to see the place where the train of our days jumped tracks, and I did not mention leverage or evidence or sins because those words shut ears and invite speeches, and I am done with speeches, and I left the page on the fridge where we keep the dentist card and a coupon for seed that we never remember to use until autumn, and I felt the coins tap lightly as if reminding me that every plan is a vote, not a verdict. Work drifted around me like soap bubbles at a fair, and I let the calls go to messages, and I turned the wrench on a stubborn bolt because I still have to fix things for people who trust my hands, and an old client told me that squeaks are just with saying good morning, and I liked that line and saved it because the house I live in has been talking in languages I am learning, and around noon a weather change swept through town with a smell like metal and rain. And I thought about the rooster clock that prefers damp air, and I pictured it waking with a proud little twitch, and I told myself that was as good a sign as any that my plan should move from draft to execution. Before I drove home I went to the switch house and stood outside the door the way a parishioner stands outside a confessional, and I checked the tape on the inner latch, and I saw a faint mark that said the place had been visited since last night, and I listened to the room as if it held a sleeping animal, and I whispered my name because names matter in rooms like this, and I slid an envelope under the door that contained 2 pages, and each page spoke to a different future, and I did not write threats, and I did not offer bargains, and I asked for presents at sunset with the door left open and the lever left alone and the chairs kept where they were and the coins left to sing if they wished, and I signed with the simplest thing I have, which is my first name, because that is the one I was given for days like this. On the way back I stopped at the river footbridge because I like to present my plans to moving water, and I held the silver dollar on my palm, and the surface below caught a seam of dull light and split it and rejoined it the way a marriage is supposed to, and I told the coin it had served and might yet serve, and the metal warmed as if agreeing, and I returned it to my pocket, and I walked home under a sky that had gathered itself into long gray ribs that looked like the underside of a whale, which is an image a stricter man than me would call melodrama, and I call the truth of the day trying on a costume. She was earlier than usual and stood in the doorway with that look she uses when she wants to audit the temperature of the room without a thermometer, and her eyes found the note on the fridge and then found me, and she did not reach for the page, and she did not smile, and she did not manufacture the kind of small kiss that had once made whole afternoons feel earned, and instead she nodded, which is the gesture of a person who understands that a script has changed and cannot be improvised back, and we moved through the hour with careful spoons, and when it was time we locked the house and the rooster clock clicked once like a referee who wants both teams to behave, and we drove toward the rail yard with the radio off, because sometimes silence is not a sentence, it is a bridge. On the way she asked if we would be safe, and I said yes, because fear would only make the room louder, and because safety on a night like this is not an objective measure, it is a choice to keep hands down and words gentle and facts straight, and I saw her watch my face for tremors and saw none, because a man can be steady on the outside while maps redraw themselves in his head, and I let her see that steadiness because I meant it not as a performance but as a promise to myself that I would not break. Things I might later need to build with, and my dry humor wanted to say welcome to the thin place, please mind the gap, and I kept that to myself because this night deserved clean floors. We parked under a busted lamp that still pretended to work, and the ivy looked like a patient thief, and I could smell cinnamon again as if someone had sprayed memory on the air, and I told myself that this smell might be ordinary and might be wind and might be nothing at all, and also that it might be the way the world fetches us by the collar and points us where we already intended to go, and her steps were quick and exact, and she stood by the door and did not touch the handle, and I reached out and put my palm flat on the wood because I like to listen by hand, and I felt the faintest tremor pass through the grain like a cat behind a curtain, and I knew someone was already inside, and that knowledge did not make me hot or cold, it made me present. I opened the door slowly, and the tape on the inner latch broke in the way I designed it to break, and somewhere in the dust the old air took a first breath, and I walked in with my shoulders low because forces for doors that have not already opened, and the room greeted us with its old weather, and we stepped over the chalk circle, and I saw the chairs still facing and the blanket still folded with that almost tidy laziness, and the silver dollar under the slanted leg sang once because a new weight had settled, and I looked up, and there he was, and his eyes were the kind men have when they think their secret is still a secret, and he realized it was not, and he did not puff up or shrink down, he simply stood the way a fence post stands after a truck clips it, and I recognized something in him that I had dreaded, which was simple confusion alloyed with need, and I felt no triumph because the human condition is not a scoreboard, and because I brought us here for truth, not for sport. No one spoke, and that was best, because words would have tripped over the tape and the dust and the timetables and fallen on their faces, and I lifted my hand and set it on the cold iron of the lever, and the old switch understood that we were at a hinge, and the room took that understanding and turned it into a little hum at the edges that did not belong to electricity, and I told myself, do not be that man who dramatizes heaviness, and yet I also told myself to honor the weight, because weight ignored returns as wreckage, and I looked at her, and I looked at him, and I looked at the chair and the coin, and I said what I had practiced, which was simple and sounded like a tool placed back in the box, and I said that this room has held a story that was not mine but touched mine, and that I had no interest in screaming, and that we would let the objects in the room and the old rules of courtesy steady the next hour, and I said that after they were done speaking I would speak, and that after we all finished the lever would move or it would not, and that choice would tell us which track belonged to whom. She sat, and the chair sang, and he stayed standing because some men cannot sit when the world tilts, and I watched a feather ride a draft across the far window, and I recognized it from my notebook as if the air had borrowed it and brought it back to show its homework, and my chest rose with a breath that finally felt like I owned it, and she began in a voice that reached back to the first year of our life together and carried forward to this one as if it were all a single long afternoon, and she told the story she needed to tell, which I will not repeat here because I am not a collector of other people's private maps, and because the important part of the story was not content but tone, and the tone was tired and clear and free of decorations and free of excuses, and it landed like rain on a roof that wants to be clean. He spoke next in short pieces that tried to be brave and often were, and he said he did not come tonight to fight, and that he would leave if asked, and that he had not expected the cold clarity of the room, and I believed him because the switch house does not favor anyone, and because I had built the evening to be without angles, and I told him to stay until the lever spoke, and he nodded, and I saw a twitch in his jaw that told me he had not learned how to lose yet, and that tonight would finish the first lesson, and that is a hard class, and I did not relish it, and I did not dread it, I simply catalogued it and let it be. When my turn came I did not make speeches, and I did not read aloud from the ledger, and I did not inventory evidence as though any of us were purchasing guilt by the pound, and I said that I believed in routine and in trains and in things that work because people show up and do the work, and that somewhere we all stopped showing up and the train kept going anyway because momentum wears a mask that looks like commitment, and I said that I would not carry momentum anymore, and that I would either have Commitment or I would have quiet, and that I could live with either, and I turned to the lever and asked it in my mind to give us a small mercy, which is another way of saying I asked myself to be brave enough to accept whichever answer arrived. The room throbbed with a hush, and the silver dollar under the chair glowed with a color I cannot name, which you can call trick of light if you prefer, and the tape on the lever hung like a pale ribbon, and somewhere outside a night bird imitated a bell, and I placed my hand on the iron and felt the heat of all the grips that had pulled it to guide trains home, and I pressed, and the bar moved with a sound that was not loud yet filled every pocket of the room, and we stood still as the old geometry of the rails beyond us changed in absentia, and I said to them that the lever only does two things and each thing leads to a different horizon, and that tonight we had chosen one by coming here and by speaking and by not breaking, and I let go and the iron rested in a new position that I had not planned, and that is how you know the thin place is honest, because it will take the decision from your hand and hand it back as if it were always its own idea. I told them to leave first and to take different streets and to keep their voices low and their hands visible and to return any souvenirs the room might have pressed into their palms, and I waited while they obeyed because obedience to a ritual matters on nights like this, and after the door closed I picked up the feather and I slid it into the ledger and I took the coin and I kissed it like a fool because fools are the only people who understand gratitude at this level, and I thanked the room for its service, and I stepped into the night where the air had that rinsed smell a town wears after lightning far off, and the busted lamp gave me half a glow, and it was enough, and I drove home with a strange calm that tasted like the first sip of good water after a long dry hour, and I knew the next part would not be clean but it would be true, and that is a bargain I can honor. I pulled into our driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled, and the house looked back at me with that steady patience it has learned from decades of winters and paint jobs and forgotten projects, and I stood on the porch and laid my hand on the frame and felt a small vibration the way you feel the rumble in your chest before you know you are about to speak, and I told the door that I would walk in like a decent man and keep the plates from breaking, and I stepped into our living room and set my keys in the bowl and my ring beside them, because a ring is a sentence and sometimes you put the period down and let the page rest. The rooster clock had inched itself forward by a handful of minutes, and the second hand ticked, then hesitated, then ticked again like a creature learning to use a healed leg, and I said aloud that I heard it, and that I would match its pace because I had no appetite for dramatics, and because the thin place had done its part, and now the ordinary had to shoulder the weight, and the ordinary loves to be asked if you ask with respect. She was in the kitchen with the light low, and the room smelled like tea and rain and the wet shine of dishwater, and she looked at my hands and then at the bowl and then at the ring, and her breath caught but did not break, and she did not launch into apologies or speeches, and this was the first mercy of the night, and I nodded like you do to a neighbor who backs out slowly and does not hit your mailbox, and I told her we would sit and that I would speak first, and that our job tonight was not to win or lose but to sort and stack and label and carry only what was still good. We sat, and the chair under me made the sound old wood makes when it wants you to know it has heard worse, and I laid out the shape of the evening we had just lived, and I left out the parts meant only for me and the lever, and I said that I had heard enough truth to build a decision, and that if she had more to lay down she could, but that I did not require it, and that there would be no tribunal because I had no interest in becoming the kind of man who confuses punishment with clarity, and I told her that the morning would bring a list, and that lists are how you move a life without dropping it. She said little, and the little was honest, and the honesty did not fix anything, but it cleared the fog the way a single gust can open a view for a moment, and in that small opening we agreed to make a clean table in the morning, and to pour coffee, and to use the notebook, and to write the names of things that would go with each of us, and the names of tasks we would complete together, as if we were building a small deck for a stranger who paid cash and wanted it done right the first time, and we agreed that no one would be a hero and no one would be a villain, and that the only characters we would play were two people who had lost the plot and were now writing a new one with smaller stakes and better sentences. After that I stood and took a blanket to the couch because a new country had already been drawn across the bed, even if no one had signed the treaty, and I do not bulldoze borders out of pride or pain, and the dog who snores like a truck engine jumped down and followed me because loyalty has its own map, and I lay on the couch and looked at the ceiling where a fan has collected a polite amount of dust, and I let my mind be quiet in the way a workshop is quiet after the last tool is put back, and I drifted into a sleep that had fewer dreams than I expected, and in the middle of it I woke with the taste of copper again, and the sound of a train horn that belonged to no train in earshot, and I listened to the night and heard water explore the pipes and footsteps in the language of settling, and for a second I felt my father near in that way sons recognize without needing to draw a diagram, and I whispered that the coin had done its job and that I would put it back in the dish when it was ready. And the quiet answered in the affirmative through the hum of the fridge. Morning arrived with a sky that considered rain and decided to wait until afternoon, and I brewed the strong coffee we use on days when overtime seems inevitable, and she came to the table with a face that had practiced half a dozen versions of grace and chose the simplest, and we opened the notebook and I drew a line down the center, not to divide but to organize, and we started with the small things because small things teach you how to carry weight, and the small things included the kitchen towels and the books and the weird lamp her aunt gave us that looks like a lighthouse committed to a different career, and we moved to the larger things and the names of accounts and the titles that sit in the drawer like trapped birds that learn not to fly, and the conversation had pauses, and during the pauses the rooster clock clicked and the dog sighed and the world outside went about its business because the world is kind that way. When we reached the ring I had set in the bowl, we stopped and looked at it like it was a specimen we had been asked to label correctly under the bright light of a lab, and the ring did not offer suggestions and I did not either, and finally I said I would leave it where it is until the house tells us what to do with it, and she accepted that because she had seen enough of the house speaking to know I was not playing games, and because on a morning like this, you do not force symbols to act on your schedule, you let them declare themselves when they are ready. We talked about the man, and that talk was short and careful and clean, and we did not try to make his outline larger than it was, and we did not collapse him into a villain because people are heavy enough without extra bricks, and she said she would end that connection cleanly, and I believed her because the lever had already done what it does, and because she spoke like someone who had stepped off a moving belt and remembered how to stand, and I did not take a victory lap because there are none in this sport, and I did not hand out a sentence because I am not a judge, and because the judgment had already landed in the way the air moved through our hall. By noon the list was serviceable and the plan was plain, and it said that she would go stay with her sister for a while because sometimes first steps need a different floor under them, and that I would keep the house long enough to hear what it wants and to see if the thin place intends to close or to stay slightly ajar, and it said that we would call the lawyer whose office smells like lemon oil and paperwork, and that we would speak like people who have done difficult tasks before and intend to do this one the same way, and it said that I would visit the switch house alone one more time because a man should not leave a working site half done, and because I had something to return. She packed a suitcase with that efficient stillness she has used on trips and funerals and weddings and job interviews, and she moved through rooms that had memorized her footsteps and let them go without complaint, and I carried the suitcase to the car, and we stood on the porch as a light rain finally began, and the first drops made the dry soil give off that scent that makes everyone believe in fresh starts whether they admit it or not, and she touched my arm in a way that meant thank you for not turning this into a soap opera, and I touched her shoulder in a way that meant I remember the real parts and they matter, and the dog looked between us like a tiebreaker and then wagged because dogs are not interested in jurisprudence. After she drove off I went back inside, and the rooster clock stopped with a little choke at the exact minute the yard saleswoman had told us it likes to stop when it wants attention, and I laughed once and then caught myself because laughter can hurt walls if you send it too hard, and I took the silver dollar from my pocket and set it under the clock base like a wedge as if to keep time from slipping, and I watched for a sign and got none, and that was the sign because sometimes the best answer the world can give is no tricks and no trumpet, and I took my jacket and the notebook and the tape that still had a few clean inches and I headed for the rail yard. The switch house sat where it always has, and yet it looked different because I had learned how to see it, and the door was closed and the tape I had tied to the lever hung loose like a ribbon after a parade, and I opened the door and the room greeted me like a workshop that knows you are there to clean up, not to make a mess, and I walked to the chair and bent and reached under, and there was the coin with a bright new nick and a warmth that had no source, and I pocketed it and stood and turned to the lever and placed my hand on the iron, and I said the thing I came to say, which was thank you, and also we are done for now, and the lever stayed where it was, and that meant it had heard me. I took the hair tie from the chalk circle and set it on the sill where it had first rested because small restorations teach bigger ones how to behave, and I folded the blanket with honest corners and picked up the paper cup and the dented thermos and put them in a bag because a room deserves to be left better than you found it, even if the people who used it did not honor that rule, and I swept the plaster dust into one neat pile and carried the feather in my pocket because the ledger had earned a companion, and when I stepped out the rain had grown intentional and the rail yard smelled like iron and history and something like absolution if you are inclined to hear it that way. On the way home I took the long route past the old practice field because I wanted to see the lights and remember the nights when we stayed until the grass turned dark and the world seemed to approve of our stubbornness, and I thought about the train I had believed in and the schedule I had worshipped, and how both had kept me safe until they did not, and how the safety had become a blindfold that hid the broken rail, and I promised myself that the next system I build will have alarms that ring before the wheel leaps, and will have hands that reach for tools before speeches, and will have more listening by hand and less telling by mouth. Back in the kitchen, I dried my jacket on the chair and set the silver dollar on the table and wrote a line in the notebook that said the lever kept its position and so will I, and then I made a simple dinner and ate it without ceremony and washed the plate and set it in the rack, and the act felt like a communion between a man and his life, and the rooster clock with the coin at its base shivered once and started again, and this time the second hand moved with a new steadiness that did not feel like the old days and did not pretend to, and I saluted it like a colleague who has learned a new skill. I slept in the bed because the treaty had moved the border and because a man cannot live forever in transition, and in the middle of the night I woke with the calm certainty that the thin place would close after one more task, and that task was in the morning, and that it would require me to walk the length of our story from front porch to fridge to bedroom to garage to street and back again, and to touch what needed touching and to say out loud what I had not yet said, which was a blessing disguised as a goodbye, and I put my hand over my heart like a man who keeps an oath, and I slept with the steady sound of the clock stitching the hours back into something that would hold until morning. Morning came with a sky the color of old zinc, and I stood before the front door and laid my hand on the wood and spoke the blessing disguised as goodbye that I had promised myself, and I said thank you for the years and the shelter and the learned routes and the false alarms and the alarms that came too late, and I asked the house to keep steady while I walked its length, and I stepped across the threshold with a care I had not shown in months, and I moved room to room, like a man reading a map he drew as a boy and forgot in a drawer and now finds in the right light. In the hall I touched the spot where the suitcase had bumped the paint on our first trip, and I felt the bump as a bruise that had healed and kept the story, and I touched the framed photograph that has always hung 1 degree off level because neither of us ever fixed it since its tilt made the faces look like they were listening, and I told those faces that they could rest and stop pretending to hear over the clatter, and in the living room I set my palm on the back of the couch where I had taken my exile, and I thanked it for holding shape and for smelling like sleep instead of defeat, and the dog jumped up and pressed his head to my thigh, and I told him that good dogs do not have to pick sides, and he wagged like a flag that prefers wind to politics. In the kitchen I stood before the bowl where the keys waited, and the ring sat like a period at the end of a paragraph we had over-edited, and I did not pick it up yet because symbols work better when you let them keep their own time, and the rooster clock ticked with a steadiness that could have fooled a stranger, and I told it that I was not fooled and that I did not require fooling and that I only needed honest seconds stacked into an honest hour, and the second hand agreed with a patient glide. And I put the kettle on to make simple tea because a man walks better with heat inside him, and while the water roused itself I opened the cheap notebook and wrote a short vow that I actually intend to keep, and it said I will not confuse routine with love again, and I will not confuse momentum with mercy, and I will listen by hand before I speak by habit. In the bedroom I set my palm on the empty side where a body had rested, and I let myself feel the outline without taking inventory, and I told the outline that it could dissipate like steam after a shower because the house did not need to hold that shape for me anymore, and the window threw a pale bar of light across the floor that looked like the edge of a platform where a small train might stop without fanfare, and I smiled because the image was too neat. And yet it fit, and before I left I opened the closet and straightened a stack of shirts because order has to begin somewhere and may as well begin with cotton and wood and patience. In the garage I touched the toolbox that has been my quiet catechism, and I thanked every screwdriver for minding its lane, and I picked up a small soft cloth and wiped the dust off the old flashlight that had followed me through this whole affair, and I set it back knowing I might not need it for a while, and then I stood still and listened, and I heard nothing unusual, and that was the unusual thing, and my dry humor said congratulations on hearing silence like it is a song, and I accepted the line. Because sometimes I am the only comedian in the room, and a man should not leave himself without material. Back inside I poured the tea and set the cup near the bowl, and I looked at the ring again, and I heard the thin place murmur from some distance like a highway you forgot to think about, and I understood that my last task was as small and as heavy as I had suspected, and I picked up the ring, and it was cool and busy with a dozen fingerprints I could not see, and I carried it to the table and set it next to the silver dollar that had sat at the base of the clock, and I put my fingers on both metal circles, and I said aloud that one belonged to the man I learned from and one belonged to the man I had been, and that both men could shake hands and let go now, and the house answered with a tiny pop from the fridge and a soft shift in the ducts, and I took that as consent from the nation of walls and vents. I put the silver dollar back in the dish by the door because the coin had come home and it deserved the sun patch that visits that spot at mid-morning, and I slid the ring into the pocket of my jacket because I wanted the world to have a say in its destination, and I leashed the dog because he insists on attending all ceremonies that involve walking, and we set out under a sky that had finally made up its mind to be bright, and the air smelled like wet pavement deciding to be dry again, and I took the route that passes the school and the bakery that loads trays as if moving bricks of daylight, and I did not feel like a widow or a victor. The first felt like a man with a task he is equipped to complete. At the river footbridge I rested my elbows on the rail and the water below ran with a measured push like a worker who does not need to show off to meet the day, and I opened my hand and saw the small ring, and I thought about the vows and the routines and the gentle kiss that used to stamp my mornings and the gentle inquiry that used to stamp my evenings, and how all of that had become a story she told on 2 stages, and how I had played my part without reading the other script, and I felt the sting that comes when you realize you loved a pattern more than a person, and also that you cannot love a person well if you love a pattern more. And I said thank you to the pattern for keeping me alive while I did not know better, and I said goodbye, and I did not throw the ring because I am not a man who throws useful metal into water for the sake of theater, and because goodbyes can look like keeping as easily as they can look like letting go. I slipped the ring back into my pocket and I smiled at my own restraint, because sometimes the sensible choice is the one that hurts cleanest, and I told the river that it had done its part already when it drew a path of dull light for me days before, and I promised to bring it news later, and the dog pressed his head to my knee and took a breath like a small engine finding idle, and we walked toward the rail yard for the last step, and on the way I stopped by the little store with the memorial bench. And I bought nothing and greeted nobody, and still left with my hands lighter, because stopping in a familiar threshold is another way to drop weight. The switch house waited with its patient ivy and its tin roof that ticks when it hears footsteps, and I went inside without ceremony, because the room and I were now colleagues who had finished a job and were rolling up cord and coiling tape, and I set the ring in the center of the chalk circle, because that is where visited things go to turn back into regular objects, and I placed the hair tie beside it because no one should be left alone in a circle on the last day, and I set the dented thermos on the sill and the paper cup in the bag, because souvenirs belong to the people who made the memories, and I am done curating the museum of a story that is not mine. And I touched the iron lever one last time and felt it warm and still as a brick in sunlight, and I told it thank you and goodbye, and it said nothing, which is the right way for iron to answer. On impulse that did not feel like impulse, I took the notebook from my jacket and tore out a page and wrote a sentence with the same pen that promised no smears, and the sentence said, "You helped me change tracks, and I will keep the tools and leave the shrine." And I folded the page and slid it under the chair leg where the silver dollar had once rung, and the chair accepted the offering with a microscopic sway, and then I stepped outside and shut the door and pressed the latch until it clicked in a way that felt like a healthy joint receiving weight, and I stood there for a breath and listened, and the room did not call me back, and the thin place thinned itself further, and I knew it would close by nightfall without fireworks or smoke, because some closures respect your neighbors. On the drive home I felt the world grow ordinary again in the nicest possible way, and the traffic abate itself, and the streetlight cycled, and the neighbor who rides a bike with a milk crate on the back waved, and I waved back, and the dog yawned like a judge announcing recess, and back in the kitchen I placed the ring in the bowl next to the keys, because that is where sentences end in this house, and I told it that it could stay until both of us no longer needed to glance at it to remember the work we did. And the rooster clock ticked with a sound that now matched my breath, and I matched it on purpose, and neither of us faked it, and I tidied the table and washed 1 cup and 2 plates and a fork and a knife, and I dried them and set them in the drawer, and the drawer shut without argument. I sent her a message with plain words and no bait, and it said the list is ready and the house is steady and the bowl holds what it holds, and we can meet at the lawyer on Thursday, and there will be no surprises, and I wish you a clear road. And after I sent it I put the phone face down, because the screen has nothing left I need, and I took the silver dollar from the dish and turned it once in my palm and set it back, and in the quiet I heard a whistle, far off, that did not belong to memory this time. And I walked to the porch, and the evening sun caught the long side of a real freight working its way across the horizon with the humility only heavy things know, and I tipped 2 fingers off my brow like a salute, and the train answered with a note that reached the small screws in my chest and tightened them exactly enough. When darkness came the house settled like a good dog at your feet, and the thin place closed with no ceremony, and I lay in the bed that was mine again, not as claim but as stewardship, and I thought about the man who trusted trains more than people, and the man who listens by hand, and I decided both men would get along fine if they took turns, and I let myself think of her without bitterness, because bitterness is a bad carpenter and it splits every board, and I said a blessing for whatever room she chooses next, and whatever clock she hangs, and whatever lever she learns to respect, and I tucked the blanket to my shoulder and slept. In the morning I kissed my own cheek with my knuckles before work, because turns out the ritual matters when you do it for the right reason, and I laughed at myself softly, because I am not a sentimental fool even when I act like one, and I asked the rooster clock if it liked the smell of rain today, and it clicked twice, which I take as a yes, and I stepped into the day with the notebook in my pocket and my tools in the truck and a map that shows fewer shortcuts and more service roads, and I did not feel unshakable, and I did not need to, because I had something better than that old word, and it is called attention, and it is called mercy, and it is called track sense, and if you keep those near you can build a life that does not need a performance to look honest. And that is how I walked out of her lie and into my own work, and the work answered back.